Hello, Year 10. Your title for today's lesson is Legal Challenges to Segregation. We are now starting our topic on civil rights, which is one of the most interesting parts of the course, and I know you'll really enjoy it. To start off with, I want you to remind yourselves of what life was like in the Deep South for African Americans in the 1920s and 30s. So could you have a go at those review questions for me? If you pause your video now to have a go at the questions. The answers to these questions are: segregation was keeping black people and white people separate, so they had to use different facilities. Question 2, it's the Deep South. Question 3, the Ku Klux Klan. Sorry, I always say that wrong. The Ku Klux Klan, or it's fine to just put the KKK in for segregation using violence. And the organisation didn't get challenged by the government because often there were supporters of the KKK high up in the police and also in the justice system. So people knew that the KKK could get away with this violence. The next thing I'd like you to do is just to go into a bit more detail about what life was like in the Jim Crow South. The Jim Crow laws were another name for the segregation laws that existed in the South. What I'd like you to do is, wherever you're doing your work, whether it's on a Word document, in your book or on paper, if you could create something that looks a little bit like this table. So you need to have on one side 5 rows, so voting, law, employment and university, and then 3 columns. I've done the description of what life was like for you, so all you need to do is copy that. You can do it in your own words if you like and make it a bit shorter. It doesn't need to be full sentences. And then for each one, I want you to explain how might that have affected the lives of African Americans. So you've got the description, but what impact would that have on African American people? There's a challenge there for you to have a go at as well, if you can. So if you pause your video now and do that, it should take you no more than 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some things that you might have put in your table. If there was any that you were struggling with, you can use what I say now to fill in any gaps. So for the first one, voting, the way that it's affected African American lives is that they couldn't elect a politician that would change the way that the laws were in the South. So it was impossible for them to elect an African American politician because they weren't able to vote. You might have also put the fact that politicians didn't need to appeal to African Americans because they knew that African Americans couldn't vote. So even white politicians wouldn't try and improve the lives of African American people. For the law, you could put down the fact that African Americans would therefore be consistently in danger because people knew that if they used violence against black people, that they wouldn't get in trouble for it. For employment, you can put down the fact that African Americans were less able to save money than white Americans and less able to improve their quality of life. They were less able to buy houses as well. And then for university, you can put down the fact that it was difficult for African American people to find better employment or to gain skills that would give them access to that employment. You might also put down the fact that it meant that there wouldn't be black people in the professions. So there were unlikely to be black lawyers, black doctors, black politicians because they couldn't go to university. So now we've reviewed what life was like during the 1920s and 30s for African Americans, we're going to start looking at some of the changes that occurred during the 1950s. So before I do that, I just want to remind you of some of the changes that occurred during the Second World War. So a crucial thing that we looked at is the fact that during the Second World War, African American soldiers fought against a racist power in the form of Nazi Germany. So when they returned home from the war, they often expected to find that America would begin to change their own racist laws. And also that America would be grateful for what African American soldiers had done. But that wasn't the case, or certainly wasn't the case in the South. And so many African Americans joined an organisation called the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. And in that organisation, that organisation then gained funding that they could use to fight legal cases that would improve the rights of African Americans. And one of those legal cases was this, Brown versus the Board of Education. So I would like you to read through the information sheet, and there are some questions at the bottom of the sheet for you to answer. You need to go to Teams to find this information sheet. And the sheet looks something like this. You can actually see it entirely on the screen here. So there's all the information and also the questions. So if you like, you can just use the video. So if you could read the information and answer the questions for me. So pause the video now while you do that. Now here you can see the one of the newspaper articles that was published on, or the day after, the decision was made to end segregation in public schools. And this decision was enforced by Chief Justice Warren. So he argued that integrated schools should be set up with all deliberate speed. So he's encouraging local boards of education to integrate schools. However, we've got to bear in mind that this process was not going to be something that everyone was happy with. From white people's point of view, most people in the Deep South had racist views about African Americans and therefore didn't want their children to be going to school with African Americans. So white people in the South often opposed this. It's worth bearing in mind that white people didn't see themselves as racist. They just thought, and from their point of view, it was acceptable to keep black people and white people separate. They would have argued they didn't want bad things to happen to black people, but that they didn't think that their children should be educated together. Now, obviously, we now see that as racist, so we recognise them as racist, even if they couldn't recognise themselves as that. This decision also wouldn't have been something that black people would have necessarily seen as, like, they would have recognised that this wasn't going to solve everything. From the point of view of a black child, going to a black school would be somewhere that they would feel safe. The quality of the education wasn't as good, that's true. But going to school with a group of white students probably would have been a fairly intimidating prospect. So even though this decision had made, it definitely didn't mean that problems were over. You get an idea of some of those problems from this picture. So here you can see some people protesting outside of a local courtroom. Obviously all the people in the picture are white and they're holding signs saying things like race mixing is communism. Obviously last lesson you looked at America's hatred of communism. So that gives you a bit of an idea as to what that sign means. It says stop race mixing. People holding American flags, obviously implying that it's a patriotic act to support segregation. So this gives you a sense of what difficulties local school boards would face when it came to integrating local schools. Now, some schools in the South did start integrating fairly quickly, but you still would have had schools that were majority white and majority black, because black people and white people tended to live in different areas. So unless it was a very small town with only one or two schools, schools will have still remained majority white and majority black. And in some states, like the one we're about to look at, the local school boards rejected integration entirely. So one of the states that refused to integrate schools as they'd been instructed to by the Supreme Court was Arkansas. Arkansas is spelled Arkansas, but it's said Arkansas. Don't ask me why. And this led to an important event in 1957 in a town called Little Rock. So what I'm going to get you to do is to read some information and answer these 4 questions. So you're going to read the information first, and then you're going to answer the questions. The information is on your screen now. Just as you're reading that, you can have a look at the picture of a woman called Elizabeth Eckford. So at the time that this photo was taken, she was 15 years old, and she was one of the students that was chosen by the local school board to attend the white school at Little Rock. And you can see the kind of horrendous experience that she's going through. If I just make that a little bit smaller for a second. So there's a group of people around her. Some of them look like they might be students, but then there are also adults as well. And they're obviously shouting insults at her. She's on her own and is clearly being intimidated. There's obviously a threat of violence. Now, the reason why this happened is because the other 8 students arrived together, but Elizabeth Eckford set off late, so she actually arrived on her own. And there were 1,000 people waiting at the school for their first day, waiting to oppose the entry of 9 black students. So when Elizabeth Eckford arrived, she was met with this scene. It must have been incredibly distressing for her. And it gives you a sense of just how angry people were about the integration of schools. You can see the picture where the woman is shouting, the woman who's shouting, who's right in the middle of the picture behind Elizabeth. She later publicly apologised for her actions, but it took 40 years to get an apology from that woman. So what I'd like you to do now is to have a read of this information about the school at Little Rock, Arkansas, and there are 4 questions for you there. Please could you answer those in full sentences? Okay, the final activity for you to do today then is to decide how far do the decision taken in the court case of Brown versus Board of Education and what happened at Little Rock, how do they show, or how far do they show that lives had improved for African Americans by 1957? So what I'd like you to do is to write down 2 subheadings: improved, stayed the same. You could do that as a table if you like, and then if you could write down at least 3 points in each side to decide to kind of help make your decision. Okay, now once you've done that, you are all done for this lesson. So you just need to make sure that you've completed everything. That was the review questions to begin with, then the questions about Little Rock, and this final activity. Okay, so once you're done with that, you can complete the lesson. Thank you, Yetan.